Good morning, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's monthly webinar series, the Forum Roundtable. My name is Laurie Regan, and I'm honored to be joined today by three brilliant and passionate experts who will be sharing their insights with us on the state of Islamism and anti-Semitism in the academy. I don't need to tell any of you how dire things have become on not only our college campuses, but also our K-12 classrooms. So today's discussion couldn't be more timely as Columbia and other universities settle actions brought by the Trump administration, and we learn of more and more problems permeating the education of youngsters before they even step foot onto a college campus. I'm honored to introduce Ruth Wisse, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Tikva Fund, retired Harvard professor, prolific author, and one of the most influential and important voices in the Jewish and campus communities in at least a generation. Asaf Romirowsky, Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa, and co-author of a forthcoming volume, October 7th, The War Over Words and Deeds. And Sam Westrop, Director of Middle East Forum's Islamist Watch and co-author of MEF's groundbreaking report, Beachhead, Georgetown U, How Foreign and Domestic Radical Actors Captured a U.S. University, which we'll be discussing a bit later in the program. Today's program will be recorded and available for viewing, so I urge you all to share it far and wide, and I also urge you to continue following and supporting the Middle East Forum and promoting all of its critically important work and programming within your networks. Welcome, Ruth, Asaf, and Sam, and thanks so much for joining us this morning. I just want to give the audience a heads up. We may be having some technical issues, and I'm not sure that everybody's videos will be working, but please bear with us as all the sound is working. Ruth, I want to start with you and a very important article that you wrote in April in the Wall Street Journal entitled, Harvard is an Islamist Outpost. You wrote that after October 7th. Quote, a committee of the new Harvard Jewish Alumni Alliance investigated the campus anti-Semitism and found it worse than we had anticipated. It had taken over not just Harvard's Center for Middle East Studies, but also the School of Public Health, the Divinity School, and figured in all departments across the university from music to medicine. You stated that you didn't believe that the federal government's threats would be effective at changing the university's culture, as its, quote, leaders don't yet understand the danger that culture poses to the country or why it required intervention. You taught at Harvard, Ruth, for over 20 years, from 1993 through 2014. I'd love for you to share what you saw during your tenure there in terms of the evolution of anti-Semitism in the framework of Islamism, why you believe anti-Semitism was allowed to flourish when no other form of hate would have been tolerated, and where you see Harvard's future given your pessimism on a change in its culture.
Thank you, Laurie, for having me on, and thank you for having me on with these distinguished co-panelists. Firstly, let me just say that the question of Harvard itself should be understood. Harvard is obviously singled out because of its prominence, and it's not necessarily representative, but I think it is symptomatic. So what we say about Harvard is more or less true about other Ivy League universities, but it shouldn't be taken as being universally true for all the campuses across the country. So in answer to this question, of course, I wrote this op-ed from my personal experience. When I left Harvard in 2014, I wrote a memoir, and the working title of that memoir was To the Graduating Class, because I wanted it to be a kind of a warning to the wonderful students whom I had taught and who had been privileged to teach, and even to my colleagues as well, about what I had seen happening from the moment I got to Harvard in 1993. So this, of course, what we're talking about here did not happen overnight, and it did not happen on its own. And I would make the point that the organization of politics against the Jews, which is my definition of anti-Semitism, the organization of politics against the Jews, is very little about the Jews. It has to do with those who are organizing politics against them. And that's what I saw happening at Harvard, the kind of rise of an adversary culture, a term that Lionel Trilling had come up with years earlier. And this adversary culture expressed itself, as I saw it immediately, through the opposition to ROTC on campus. So here were young professors and some of these were tenured radicals for sure, but everybody else going along with them, forbidding the presence of ROTC on campus. And that was the case for 40 years while I was at Harvard. 40 years, that's 10 iterations, full iterations of classes, 10 full classes. Now, to me, this was in itself horrific, and I spoke against it whenever I could, because what does it mean for a college not to allow the training of students at exactly the age when they should be going into the military, when the best of them should be training for the military in one form or another? What does it mean for a college, and especially Harvard, that has plaques up everywhere to those who fought in the wars, to prevent students, to actively prevent students from going into the military? Not only does it not encourage them, but it actively discourages them, and it kind of gives them the message that you're too good to go into the military. So this was really like the anchor of that adversary culture. And then other things began quickly to add up to it. And I mentioned many of these, but there may be even others. Firstly, there was identity politics, which was immediately being introduced through what I called group preferences. This was called euphemistically affirmative action. Well, I never agreed to call it affirmative action. It was group preferences. And obviously it introduced the idea that there were some groups, presumably the groups who needed the most help, but there were certain groups that were going to be advantaged to the disadvantage of others, encouraging everything that went with it. And then there was the very active beginnings of a African-American anti-Semitism on campus. I won't go on for much longer, but just to say that in the summer before I came to Harvard, in the summer of 1992, I was so encouraged by the appearance in the New York Times of a full-page op-ed. The New York Times found this so important that it gave a full page of the op-ed to my new colleague, Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates, who has since become extremely well-known and famous. And Henry Louis Gates wrote about the best article on the rise of African-American anti-Semitism, the reasons for it, and particularly its purpose. And so when I came to Harvard, I thought, this is wonderful. Here's a place that already knows what the problems are. But I must say that he was never heard from again on this subject. And particularly the more extreme this branch of the adversary culture grew at Harvard, the less anybody in the African American Studies program was heard from. And in fact, they became one of its beneficiaries. And so I need hardly go on to all the other movements that other people know about. The rise of anti-colonialism, the rise of anti-Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street movement. So all these adversarial movements began to gel. And of course, the idea of what is called intersectionality, namely the idea that all of these grievance movements are going to find one another. Well, they did find one another, and they began to coalesce again around what? Well, now here's where we come in. Around what else but the Palestinian cause, which was now presenting itself as the flag of anti-Jewish politics. So the organization of politics against the Jews, which begins in the Middle East in the 1940s and then begins to, make its way ideologically into the universities, we can go over all that ground. That is very much what we're speaking about here, but I just want to say that the readiness for it, the ground for it, was already prepared by all these movements that I am describing.
Thank you, Ruth. That was a terrific summary in a brief period of time, and we're going to get into some of this in more depth. I'm going to ask Sam a question. Sam, we're going to turn shortly to foreign funding, and in particular your report on Georgetown. But I wanted to first try and understand on a moral level how Islamists have been able to infect the minds of so many young people. What we've seen start on college campuses but expand well beyond is this red-green alliance of Marxists and communists joining forces with Islamists who would otherwise want to see most of these leftists dead. Nonetheless, their hatred for Jews seems to be a unifying force for them. I've heard you discuss Islamist influence on the right as well. So can you spend some time discussing the infiltration of Islamists into the campus culture and whether you think it can be stopped given how deeply embedded it seems to be? And would you go so far as to say that domestic academics are working with foreign terrorist organizations? And if that's the case, how is this allowed to continue?
It's an important question. I think the first thing to remember is that Islamism, to some extent, emerged from the Western academic system. It was British-trained Muslim thinkers in South Asia, particularly, that played an enormous role in the development of 19th and 20th century Islamist ideas. So Western academia is a natural home for Islamist ideologues. And over the last 60 years, particularly since 1960, and since a considerable amount of immigration of middle-class, educated Muslims from the Muslim world, many of whom were harboring Islamist ideas associated with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, and then from South Asia, groups like Jamaat-e-Islami. These ideologues found welcoming homes in Western universities. And indeed, you can really pinpoint the origins of American domestic Islamism to the original academics and students in the 1960s, coming from the Arab world and also South Asia. So yes, academia has always been important to Islamism. But what has happened over the past 60 years is that has turned from being a useful institution to organize this collection of Islamist academics and competing Islamist movements. And instead, Islamists have seen the universities as something to grasp, something to control, something to influence themselves. We have a Georgetown report that just came out, as you mentioned, that I think illustrates this point rather neatly. But by and large, we can point to dozens of Islamist networks across the United States who have spent decades buying their way into American universities, purchasing chairs, setting up departments, setting up institutions within the universities, quasi think tanks, and that sort of thing. We can see a rather symbiotic relationship. We see universities pouring money into Islamist groups as subcontractors, and then Islamist 501c non-profits moving money back into the universities. So it's a very interdependent relationship. And of course, it's complicated further by foreign Islamist funding as well. So Qatar is a particularly large donor to American universities, at least a billion over the last 10, 20 years. But there's also unreported funding from places like Turkey, Pakistan, Malaysia. Then there are diaspora groups of foreign Islamists. So, for example, the Iranian regime, there are many supporters here in the United States, wealthy Iranian Americans, very supportive of the IRGC. And other Iranian regime institutions who have set up within the US non-profits that fund more radical elements on universities, seemingly at the behest of the Iranian regime. At the very least, it's in the interests of the Iranian regime. So, yes, there has been a concerted effort to ideologically, financially, logistically, academically, intellectually mold Western academia to Islamist causes. Now, when I say Islamism, I should point out there are many different Islamist movements, and it's only a particular subset of those movements that is engaging in this behavior. If you look at, say, the Deobandis or the Salafis, you won't really find them too close to campus. But the Muslim Brotherhood, certain Shia groups, Jamaat-e-Islami, which I mentioned, yes, very active all over campus. And I'll get to Georgetown in a bit, because I think that's just the most fascinating example of this phenomenon. And then finally, Laurie, in terms of how that relates to other ideologies, particularly that of the fashionable militant left found so easily within student societies and campus culture. Well, that's partly deliberate. That's Islamists realizing they don't have the manpower on universities to always get what they want, and so leftist foot soldiers are a useful proxy for them. But it goes both ways as well. The leftist groups tend to be wildly disorganized. If you take something like Students for Justice in Palestine, it was originally established by Islamists linked to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. But if you look at the actual branches on campuses, it's not Islamist students running them. It's largely far left, non-binary identifying types who welcome the logistical support and the occasional financial support from a central Islamist hub, but by and large are ideologically autonomous leftists. So there's and as you can imagine, that brings tension occasionally, because not all Islamists like everything the left has to say, and not all of the militant left like everything Islamists have to say. And I think that's the reason you haven't seen a true merging of these competing ideological forces. But no doubt, the sheer scale and variety of Islamist influence, the willing foot soldiers of the left, both students and academics, to do Islamist causes, and the pervasiveness of Islamist and left narratives around things like Islamophobia or other buzzwords, has certainly changed American academia indelibly. There is, I think, a limit, though, to that alliance because of those tensions I've mentioned. And I know you said not that I focus on the right in the past. And I think it's worth mentioning here. There is a growing number of slightly more conservative academics who are now looking to American Muslims as potential allies in academia as well. The more conservative parts of American Islam, including its Islamists. And broadly, there are, yes, particular thinkers on campuses, and this is a growing phenomenon, who see Islamism as a conservative buttress, as a way to combat the threat of the left. So, in other words, just as a sort of word of warning for the future, this has been an issue with the left on campuses. Let's hope it doesn't become an issue with the right as well.
Thanks, Sam. Asaf, we're going to go back to you to touch on the last question I asked you, and it was related to pretty much the changes that you've seen in your career, but with a focus on administrators. And Sam brought up SJP. You and I have written articles on college administrators needing to address these issues. So can you touch on that?
Again, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with Sam, Ruth, and you. No disagreement with any of my co-panelists. I mean, I think that what we've seen, and related to Ruth's points as well, is that I would argue that today, one of the technical aspects of the key aspects of this whole movement itself, and BDS and anti-Semitism at large, is the use of the word anti-Zionism. There's been a capacious debate in the United States about, and this is, all part of the, what allowed a lot of this to thrive and to normalize within American society and within the academy at large, has to do with the fact is, when does anti-Zionism bleed into anti-Semitism? I would argue, and I think that this is really the, especially what has become so pervasive and pernicious, especially post 10/7, is that anti-Zionism today is really code name, or really, synonymous to what I would argue as the anti-normalization aspect that plays into the environment of not allowing Israel to have any edge whatsoever in this debate. And, of course, what allows the intellectualizing of the fact that we were not refused to normalize Israel in any way, shape, or form. And this is what you're seeing happening out of academics who've institutionalized this, and the fact that Israel is abnormal in any way, shape, or form. And as a result of that, this is what allows the academy to kind of buttress itself, and to Sam's point, unify itself with these groups on the campuses to illustrate their ideologies. I think that 30, 40 years ago, there has been, obviously debates, in the United States, and debates on American college campuses regarding reconciliation, two-state solution issues. The fact of the matter is that the debate about Israel and about Zionism is really about Israel's right to exist, period. And the fact that you saw post 10/7 this zeal and adulation and pride of supporting proudly Hamas and Hezbollah on American college campuses, and you had university professors, to your point, who were going and basically saying this is correct. Not only was Israel a white settler colonial project, if is it indeed true, which of course we believe it to be true, this is decolonialism. Thereby it is justified. So you saw all these professors who basically came out with their statements saying this is colonialism, it's justified, resistance by all means necessary, globalizing intifada, and everything that we're currently have now become accustomed to within the trigger words and within this narrative. What added to the nefarious element of the university architecture is not only that we've had professors who teach based on their politics as a result of the foundation building of the influx of billions of dollars that have been basically pouring into our American institutions in order to buy the politics and the narrative in which these topics are being taught, in particular within the area of Middle East studies, but I would argue also within the humanities at large. You've also seen administrators who have also jumped onto the bandwagon as a result of their tokenism, as far as that we are representative of the good, of the left. And so that has allowed them to also institute within that architecture, and we've seen it in particular within the architecture of DEI administrators who've been able to insert their own politics into how university conducts itself. Not only that, the portfolio of anti-Semitism fell on the DEI officers. They wouldn't know what anti-Semitism was if it fell on their heads, but they allowed them to also curb the understanding of what actually racism means. Anti-Semitism is racism, but it is not seen as such. And as a result of that, they've also been able to navigate and institute their own politics. That's also part of the institutionalization of the normalizing of anti-Semitism within the American Academy, allowing outside administrators and faculty, and of course all compiled with these kind of foot soldiers that are coming out of the student bodies as well, to kind of create this Palestinian exceptionism free zone that allows, this is the only cause celeb of the day, and any other diverging point of view is not accepted. And so that's part of this architecture that we have entered in. When you joined SPME, Lori, I think that there has been, there was still an ongoing debate. And you and I agree, and this was never a debate in our minds, but there was a debate at large as far as, when does anti-Zionism, which was defined as legitimate criticism of the state of Israel. I'm only a critic, I'm not a racist, so I'm just an anti-Zionist. But if you look at all of this, they have always been synonymous, but it allowed this debate to take place. BDS itself also used in terminology of justice and as far as legitimate critique, even though if you, again, all of us know and understand the fact that once you dive into the demands of the BDS movement, which has been infiltrated and has always been, the tentacles, related to Sam's work as far as the Islamist narrative itself, has allowed this to infiltrate into the academy and sell it as part of the basic tenets of the academy. If you care about justice, if you care about, the right of others, then you must support the Palestinian narrative, no exception whatsoever. The concern, and I think that, this is, something you mentioned lastly in the hearings that came out on Capitol Hill as it related to the chancellor from Berkeley. Fascinating enough, he was talking about Osama Makdisi. Makdisi happens to be also Edward Said's nephew, which was not mentioned in the testimonial at all. Said's impact cannot be minimized at large and is really one of the key proponents of the of Orientalism, as all of us know and aware, in American Academy. And of course, the fact that his nephew is seen, of course, as not only legitimate pedigree and a fine scholar at Berkeley, notwithstanding what he says, is of course quite telling at large. Many of us remember the famous picture of Said throwing rocks at the border, when it came to Israel, supporting Hezbollah and others. That was also an exercise of academic freedom, according to Edward Said, but also part of the rise of this scholar activism phenomenon that has infiltrated the American Academy. And this is also part of the feature and a dimension that I think also Ruth was alluding to, and this is where I would say that activism has replaced scholarship. And these scholar activists that have been really utilizing the American and hijacking these tenured radicals since the 1960s and prior to that in the American Academy have basically allowed all of this to be dumbed down, which is what we've seen with this cacophony of voices and everything we've seen post 10/7 is that all these acts, the encampments themselves, forcing students to go to the encampments, to pro-Palestinian rallies, all of that has become a feature of what is defined today as quote-unquote scholarship. And so the university is unfortunately losing in that regard, where people are being judged not based on actual work, but actual based on this activism. And the cause célèbre of the day happens to be, of course, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism, all correlated together with, of course, supporting the one cause that everybody should get behind, and that is Palestinianism, no matter what. And there's no distinction whatsoever whether these groups are Islamist or where they come from, and they just need to support that because the number one cause is this cause of justice in a very binary environment where Israelis, Jews can do no right and the Palestinians can do no wrong, which is part of the lack of discourse that is happening on these very issues in the academy, which is what has really now led to positively, the hearings on Capitol Hill and others looking to see exactly what are these universities actually producing, what do they actually stand for. Unfortunately, we do not have many more. Ruth is now retired as emeritus, and we need more people, like her and disciples in the academy to continue on making sure that there is balance in the academy, which is a bigger issue that we can obviously dive into also.
We have so much to cover, Ruth. I'm going to turn back to you now and back to your article, because you mentioned in the article that in 2007 you began warning successive presidents and deans at Harvard that academic standards were being violated by the substitution of anti-Israel propaganda for the Middle East Study Center. You stated that, quote, the goal of destroying Israel remains central to Arab and Islamist identity and was admitted to Harvard along with some foreign students and investors. And then you talked about the amount of foreign money that has been pumped in, $100 million between 2020 and 2024 to Harvard from foreign investors. There's been a lot of reports on this, and again, we're going to get into that in great detail in terms of Georgetown with Sam. But do you think do you think that colleges and the administrators were prone to favor the foreign money spigot to the point that they ignored what was happening around them? And I'm also wondering, Ruth, this is, I'm sure, something that you can get into. The DEI initiatives and you mentioned briefly before, occupation, colonization, apartheid. Harvard just stated that it's going to purge its DEI initiatives, but I think that they probably are just going to change some language. What are your thoughts on that? And campus codes of conduct and why they just haven't ever been used to protect Jewish students?
Well, look, I'm very grateful for this, and the question would really be how these ideas that are so importantly being discussed here, every word that Sam and that Asaf have said and that you have asked in your questions, if one could get those ideas circulated and understood, that would, of course, be the task before us. I would like to just add something to what we're saying here, and it's a bigger issue, and it's one of the ones that we leave out. All of this was possible because of the vacuum that was created in the universities. And I'm afraid that it was created in the universities as a reflection of something that was happening in the polity. And that is that there is nothing of America being conveyed. There is no national vision that is being conveyed in the education system itself. And from a Jewish point of view, which is not usually how we tend to look at the world around us, but I would say that it's the healthiest point of view with which we should begin, we remained a people through history, primarily through the idea of conveying educating from generation to generation. And the most important sentences with which the Talmud begin is that Moses conveyed this to Joshua, Joshua gave it to the others. This is how we begin, this is how we go. And we know what it was that Moses said, we know what it was that Joshua said. We repeat it year after year, the same ideas. We know that this is the foundation of civilization, and we go over it with the most intelligent minds of every generation, dedicated primarily to the reinterpretation and the retransmission of these ideas. Now, there is nothing of that happening in the American Academy, in my experience. Nothing. And every time there was a discussion of, for example, a core program that would be on American studies or on what America signifies or on the importance, really, of this republic and this great experiment in history, every time that came up, there was a tremendous idea that, oh my God, that's kind of chauvinism. And it's as if what Asaf is saying about the inculcation of bad values, those are allowed. But the idea that one has to reinforce the good and that one has to reteach why this is so important. What is the Constitution? Why is America exceptional? How did this miracle happen 250 years ago? There's never been a system of politics that has been, so successful and has provided so many freedoms. To take that for granted, not to have any idea of how this should be taught in grade 1, in grade 2, in grade 3, then reformulated at high school, and then primarily taught at the university as creatively as it possibly can be. None of that is being done. And I think that the role of Jews in this is so important, because I think that to the degree that we have done this in terms of teaching the importance of the recovery of Zion, we in a sense have reinforced that idea, that we are a people that existed for 3,000 years or more, that we are the foundations of civilization, and our civilization has to be, reaffirmed, it has to be upheld, and that it is now the miracle of its reconstitution in the state of Israel. There's been nothing like that in human history. What is that, after 2,000 years? A people that has had such a strong sense of itself that under those conditions, in so many countries, under so many different cultures, has been able to sustain itself and then to reclaim its sovereignty in its land after so many, and after the Holocaust, after 1/3 of its people being destroyed in that most humiliating way. You see what I'm saying here, that the Jewish idea of how one transmits a culture and what is the civilization that one stands for, this has never been more important. But the most important thing is to link it to America and to persuade the Americans again that this is something that they have to take hold of, and particularly at the highest levels. So I would say that with the pressures of what we're saying here, of all the negative forces that are coming in, all the destructive forces, yes, bad ideas drive out the good, and have they ever done that? But the doors have been wide open, and one of the reasons for that is like an empty-headedness, taking it for granted maybe, but I think that people no longer even take it for granted. So with all that we're doing, Laurie, I would say that if there are ideas to be conveyed and messages to be gotten across through the work that we're doing, it should not be only about the bad that is being allowed to overtake the universities. It has to be about how these universities allowed for that vacuum to be created, which of course is going to be taken over by people who do have very powerful ideas of what they stand for and how much is owing to them. And as Asaf really said, they're not shy about coming in and demanding what is their due. They are very proud of what they stand for. And one last thing, that what they stand for, by the way, is the power of negative advertising. And this is, one of the things that I've tried to do in the book on Jews and power and otherwise is to just show what are the functions of anti-Semitism. What are the creative functions of this movement and this strategy in politics? And one of the most effective things is that this is the only completely negative ideology. It is not like socialism or communism or fascism that pretends to offer something. No, it's all about, if you destroy this evil, then our lives will be better. If you get rid of the Jews, that will clear the space. If you get rid of the Jews, that will clear the racism or bring justice, or whatever the cause is. You see, it is a fantastically powerful negative ideology. And when combined with socialism, that has, by the way, many negative qualities too, because socialism is primarily against capitalism. Right? So this negativism has really come in, and it has again replaced all positive ideas, which, by the way, are so much more difficult to uphold. Because if you look at the way our campaigning has gone, think of how quickly all these people who say, I'm not going to do negative campaigning, I'm not going to do negative campaigning, within 2 minutes, they're doing a negative campaign, because it's so much easier to destroy your opponent than to build what it is that you stand for. And I think that we are somewhat in that position now, that we are in the position of having to provide a positive program as well as destroying the negativity against us.
Sam, I'm going to turn to you with your report, Beachhead, Georgetown U, How Foreign and Domestic Radical Actors Captured a U.S. University. And we're going to put the link to that in the chat. The report begins, quote, over the past 3 decades, malign foreign influence actors from Qatar, Turkey, and Malaysia have entrenched themselves at Georgetown University, using the institution's campuses in Washington, D.C. and Doha as basis to propagate Islamist ideology, train sympathetic academics and diplomats, and fundamentally reshape Middle East and Islamic studies. I just want to add, before you talk about the report, that while many of our nation's universities receive foreign funding and that helps to infiltrate the hearts and minds of our young people, Georgetown's particularly problematic because it is the training ground for so many individuals who go into public service, including diplomats and other State Department officials, intelligence officers, academics, policymakers. So the brainwashing has serious implications on U.S. foreign policy and national security. So Sam, please share. I know you could spend an hour talking about the report, but if you could just take a couple minutes to let us know what you found and the implications for it.
Absolutely. About 30 years ago, a group of academics and financier types, Islamists, mostly based in Virginia, got together to form something at the time known as the SAR network, and these days known as the SAFA network. And this network is a collection of over 100 for-profit and non-profit institutions run out of the same addresses by the same people. You can tie the network together very easily just using the paperwork they file. This network comprises for-profit businesses, poultry farms. It includes schools and magazines. It has think tanks and banks. And all manner of property investment and other for-profit and non-profit institutions. The reason I bring this up is the SAFA network, among its possessions, owns a bit of Georgetown University. It owns something called the ACMCU, the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, which the State Department considers one of the premier training grounds for diplomats. But it's not just diplomats that the ACMCU trains. It trains law enforcement specialists, intelligence service people, other academics, civil servants of all kinds. In other words, the ACMCU, controlled by this thing, the SAFA network, has fundamentally shaped American foreign and domestic policy, as well as, to some extent, American academia over the past 30 years. The ACMCU was set up in the 1990s with the help of SAFA. This SAFA network has staffed the ACMCU. It has funded directly and secured funding for the ACMCU. And it has introduced academics at the ACMCU to terror-tide Islamists around the world, particularly in three places: Qatar, Turkey, and Malaysia. Now, why is the Safa network so bad? Well, it was investigated in the 2000s by the federal government as part of a very serious Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas financing network in the United States. Indeed, it's a bit more than that. The people behind the Safa network not only were supportive of terror and involved in terror finance, but really are the key Islamist thinkers in the West today. Their flagship institution, a group called the International Institute for Islamic Thought, is arguably the top Islamist think tank in the Western world. And it is from this Institute of Islamic Thought that key Islamist ideas have been propounded and developed and are now put into practice in places across the Middle East, the Far East, and so on. So this Safa network doesn't just control universities, it exports Islamism globally. The reason this worries us so much is that not only has the ACMCU at Georgetown been under the control of this network, but this network also has its fingers in other academic centers around the West. Harvard has been a beneficiary of Safa networks, large S, as has Cambridge in the UK and a few others. This network, comprising, as I mentioned, academics, financiers, and activists, has managed to turn prestigious universities into agents of the Islamist agenda. I do encourage all those listening to read our report. I think it paints a really quite shocking picture. The key, well, actually, the other thing I'll mention is that in the process of writing this report, we came across one fellow at the ACMCU, a man called Badr Khan Suri. That name might be familiar to those listening, because Badr Khan Suri was arrested by the Trump administration's DHS agents earlier this year because of his overt support for Hamas. And in fact, DHS agents testifying in court cited our writing as the reason for that arrest. So this report we've released has already had some effect. We hope it's going to continue to have an effect further on. The key thing we'd like to see change in the university system and the way that government regulates and funds the university system is efforts to curtail radical domestic and foreign influence, particularly through the 501c nonprofit system. And the Safa network is such a good example of this. We found at least $4 million from Safa network institutions going directly to the ACMCU at Georgetown. But we also found millions of hundreds of millions of dollars of Qatari monies, millions of dollars of Turkish monies that went unreported to the Department of Education, all working their way into the pockets of Georgetown faculty and departments. So this is an enormous problem with hundreds of millions of dollars influencing matters. And it, as I say, has shaped and reshaped American academia and American government policy towards the Middle East and the Islamic world fundamentally over the past 30 years. There's quite a few things I could touch on related to the report, but I know you wanted me to keep it relatively brief, Laurie, so I'll stop there. But as Anaf has posted the link to the report in the chat, so please do have a read. And I'm happy to delve into any particular section should you want me to.
Thanks, Sam. I mean, again, we could have spent an entire hour talking about the report, and I urge everybody to go to the MEF website and read the report and check out a lot that's been that Sam has put out there is critically important. Asaf, I want to make sure that we have time to talk about K through 12 education, as too many Americans remain uninformed about how the Islamists have infiltrated elementary through high school curricula and are impacting young minds with hate and lies about Israel and Jews more broadly. Philly, where you live, has some of the worst schools in the country from the perspective of anti-Israel and anti-Western curricula. Philly public libraries are also joining in the indoctrination, teaching kids all sorts of horrible things, that Israelis are murdering children in Gaza and promoting Palestine liberation movements. California ethnic studies curriculum's horrendous. Montgomery County, Maryland, New York City schools. I could go on and on and on. And even in Teaneck, New Jersey, where there were walkouts for Palestine after 10/7. the reality is that this problem is nationwide. And then we have the National Education Association, which has been in the news the past 2 weeks. It's one of the country's largest teachers unions, which recently attempted to cut off ties with the ADL, and it's now erasing references to Jews murdered in the Holocaust. It's also it's issuing its 2025 handbook to its 3 million members who use it as a guide in their teaching. And those members are being told to prioritize the Palestinian Nakba, and that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, as Asaf, you discussed a little while ago. There's a lot I could talk about with all of this, but please, I want to make sure that we have time for you to share your thoughts on what's happening K through 12 and how frightening is it and what can be done to stop it.
Cool. So just to jump off, Ruth's point, which I think is also extremely critical and to understand as well, the same kind of rejectionism of America and the West within the larger higher education is what has trickled down into the K through 12 narrative. I mean, let's put this also in perspective as well. I mean, by the time they get to the campuses, it's already too late. They're building the foundation in early years in K through 12. Sam has done a great deal of work also on, how the Qatari Foundation and others have bought K through 12 education. And so the anathema that's playing out within, Jewish civilization, which has been a basic tenet of American civilization and why we talk about shared values and rejectionism and what's not. One of the interesting paradigms, just parenthetically, that of course Ruth articulates in her book Jews in Power, is of course that Jews were liked when they were attacked, when we were when we were weak. And so the hatred that really amounts to the growing animosity towards Jews goes to the fact that Jews are possessing power and then they're abusing power. That narrative has trickled down into widely into the K through 12 narrative. And not only that, I mean, I've done a great deal of work over the years on Quaker education. And here in Pennsylvania, one of the many of the Quaker schools, which interestingly enough is important to note that one of the oldest Quaker schools is based in Ramallah. The Ramallah Quaker School is a feeder to the Quaker schools here in Pennsylvania. And so the ideology, and interestingly enough, currently today, Joyce Julie, who is the Secretary General, so to speak, of the American Friends Service Committee, happens to be a former superintendent of the Ramallah School. And she's the one who is instituting within the Quaker schools Nakba ideology, Holocaust inversion, all the same kind of narratives that you're seeing that is basically being instituted and where kids are being indoctrinated within this narrative. It's also important to note, and within that understanding of how this partnership works between higher education and the K through 12. Those of you who are on the show, I'm sure aware from the work that the Forum has done regarding issues regarding Title VI centers. Part of the requirement of Title VI centers, especially Middle East Studies centers, is also going out into the community offering free education. So the same bias that you see existing within the Department of Middle East Studies, if those so-called experts are calling public schools to offer them free programs on the Arab-Israeli conflict, the history of the Middle East, Palestinianism, it is all what you're seeing play out here. Parenthetically, it's worthy of note that when the Palestine Writers Festival was taking place right before October 7th, at Penn, one of the main organizers was an individual who is another activist within the K through 12 greater Philadelphia area. And so all of these things are happening all around the country. It is not unique to Pennsylvania. And as you mentioned, Lori, ethnic studies, there's a huge correlation between the case at San Francisco State and the individuals who are responsible for all the challenges, and all the Islamism that we see at San Francisco State and the biases, and going into the concretizing of ethnic studies within the K through 12 areas. Those are all cases that are happening, and there's a clear correlation that's playing out here, all with the idea, and I think that this is really going back to Ruth's earlier point about the fact that there has been a rejectionism of Western American values in Western institutions. I mean, this is where a critical part of how we educate our kids and how we educate Americans, because what there was happening here is a concerted effort to use and abuse Western institutions and turn them on their head. This goes against every basic tenet of how America was founded and the liberalism that we talk about, but now they're being used and abused by tyrannical totalitarian regimes that are basically using our democracy against us, and they know that the way to make this happen is through what we consider to be in the social sciences agents of soft power. And that happens to be education being number one. And so you've created an entire foundation and a pyramid that's being built where the future students who are entering the academy are already sanitized to these viewpoints and are already viewing and are already believing that anti-Semitism has to be part and parcel of their tokenism as Americans, which is where also is a larger issue that needs to be looked at as far as U.S.-Israel relations. What are the younger generation going to think about this, about the significance of the U.S.-Israel alliance if they are taught but believed to reject that? And this is also a significant aspect that plays out here as well. Another feature to all of this, which should not be remiss, is of course the growing fifth column, even within the American Jewish community, where American Jews, related to a lot of going back again to got to give Ruth should take the amount of credit she deserves on her work in her book. There has to do with the fact that there is a feeling of guilt of the success. And so they try to find a way to carve out a way where they're saying, well, I'm a good Jew because I reject my Zionism as part of my identity. And thereby, the Jews are kind of a double whammy written by third world guilt and Jewish guilt. And so they're the ones also within who are, groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, or neither Jewish or for Peace, are the fellow travelers of the Quaker groups and other organizations to give the fig leaf of Judaism, or what the kind of guilt-ridden Jews are that are basically trying to put all the onus on the animosity and the hatred when it comes to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And so that's another dimension that's playing out here. But we need to be extremely concerned about the K through 12 element here, because there is less discourse and less debate. Not to mention the materials that are being used in these classrooms and are being put forth as fait accompli. And so there's not only a feature of the teachers who are teaching this, but also the kind of textbooks and the kind of materials that are being used to disseminate that information. You mentioned, as well, the aspect of what's been happening in the libraries around the country. Again, these are federal dollars that are offering free programs to educate. So the idea that, quote unquote, it's free, this is where the indoctrination is happening, as well as in the sanitizing of trying to buy into this very distinct dogmatic thinking about how the Middle East should be taught. And this is all instituted within not only public schools, but also within private schools. And this is something, a larger feature that needs to be concerned, not to mention, and we can't, and this is something that cannot be forgotten. And this, I think, parenthetically relates to some of the work that Sam has done. Also, the foreign money that's being in as far as buying. So if you're going to crack down on foreign money that's going to higher education, the mother of the Emir of Qatar, it sits on the Qatari Foundation, is the one in charge of K through 12 education, and she's giving making sure that all this money is coming in, ensuring the fact that this is where the instituted Qatari lobby has been finding a significant role in American society. I mean, you mentioned the hearing last week, Lori. The chief lobbyist of Qatar was sitting right behind the chancellor of Berkeley, who was right, and Georgetown, in those images. Sam is laughing. I know, we all laugh when we saw it, but it was so telling about the reality, about how much they have control. They are the puppet masters in many of these ways, controlling where the money is going through, and they're sitting right there behind him because they know they have a significant hold, not only in higher education, but also going down. And that's a major concern that we need to be looking at. And I would argue, and this is something that, living in Pennsylvania, that is a major concern to schools here in Pennsylvania. There's been a huge controversy as far as the public schools that are happening here. But a lot of this has to do with the lack of definition statewide, on the federal and on the state level, of what anti-Semitism is. The adaptation of the IRA definition and understanding exactly, because absent defining the problem, we're not finding good solutions until we have defined the problems. And so these issues need to be well defined and be very well, and to prescribe clear measures of how to tackle these problems.
We only have a couple minutes to address some of these issues. And Sam, I know that your report also had a number of policy recommendations. So I want to start with Ruth and ask your thoughts, Ruth, on the way the Trump administration is handling everything right now. There's discussion about closing down the DOE, Department of Education, which I think is a great idea, but at the same time, we're going to throw stuff back to the states. And that means that the issues that Asaf just talked about may be even worse. So is there a role that the feds can play in this? And quick lightning round, Ruth to Sam.
You're asking about the initiatives of the Trump administration and how that's working. Well, this is pretty worrisome in some respects. Of course, almost everything that Trump is doing has been welcome. From my perspective and from the perspective of many people whom I happen to know happily. Of course, he knows where the problems lie, and his idea is to fight and to smash. And one of the most valuable things that he has brought into our midst is the idea that there is evil out there, and that what you have to do is you have to go at it and you have to destroy it. The problem is that he is doing it without a consistent plan, and that the way in which he is doing it is obviously not the way in which many of us would go about it. What had to be done is the reconstruction of a kind of real conservatism, and the conservative movement that stands for conserving the republic, exactly what I was talking about before. And that would have been the movement with which we are naturally allied. And it is very dangerous for us not to think in terms of alliances, and alliances not only with pockets of individuals, those who are obviously friendly to us and which we would like to keep in our midst, the alliance with evangelical Christians, the alliance with Latinos, the alliances that are being built by various organizations very creatively. Of course we want to do that, but our major alliance, in a sense, is with conservative ideas, and the conservative ideas that lock into us. So every once in a while you sort of think of something, and so I thought of this. Jews are the blue and white and the red, white, and blue. How do you take what Asaf was saying and what we all know to be true, the interlocking of Jewish sources with the building of America, and how do you spell that out so that we know that that is a natural affinity, and that anyone who is teaching for America understands that they also have to include Israel in that Israel is not contingent, because you know why? Because if Israel is contingent, then the United States of America is contingent. And that's exactly what the people who are coming in with all this money, and with the Red-Green Alliance that is being pushed as well through the United Nations, which the United States still supports, that all of this is really meant for the destruction of what the United States and its freedoms and its way of life and its democracy stands for. None of these are democracies, right? And what they want to destroy is the difficulty of and the complexity and the magnificence of the civilization that we believe in and that we stand for. Here's one of the things that bothers me. It's what I call the McCarthy, to pull a McCarthy. That's what I'm worried about. If you know what I'm talking about, maybe not. It's like a private language. If you remember, and I remember this very well, McCarthy came in to defeat the communists. And this was a very important thing because communism had really eaten its way into parts of the American system, certainly away from the American government, certainly into the academy. Communism was much more widespread than many people wanted to acknowledge, and, by the way, into the Jewish community as well. And it's never completely disappeared. Well, then McCarthy came on the scene, and he came at it very heavy-handed, and he seemed to be an autocrat, and he was very quickly turfed out by his own party and by Congress itself. But no matter how quickly he was turfed out, the communists, the left, the whole liberal left, then used McCarthy as the excuse for never following up on the dangers that he pointed out. And suddenly, all the books that were written, all the movies that were made, were all movies about how awful the Red Scare was, how awful McCarthyism was, how horrible it was. And that's what we still live with. I mean, many of the best people we know still believe that the greatest enemy in that period was McCarthy, for goodness sake. And communism completely got a free hand. So many of this door that has been opened to Islamism and to this unification of the left with Islamism was opened up by the communists. And of course, they trained many of the people who then became prominent in Middle Eastern countries and in third world countries. So what I'm worried about here is that Trump is going to create the same phenomenon, that they're going to pull a McCarthy, that they're going to use Trump to the extent that he overreaches, to the extent that he doesn't get the job done. They're going to point at him as being the evil rather than everything that it is that we're talking about. Now, this is something that one has to be prepared for in advance. So in our language and in our construction and in our fighting the fight, and which we're fighting is the fight of ideas, we have to be smarter, and we have to be really much smarter than they are. We have not even thought of how to outsmart them. You know, we think in terms of the battlefield, we think of all kinds of things, but we don't even think of how do you win these battles in just the plain way in which you explain it to people so that they know the difference between the good and the bad. So I would like to prepare in some way for that next step, and to know that in all the time that we're speaking about what Trump is doing and all the rest, that we keep our own minds clear as to what it is that we need to see done, and to make sure that he does not get blamed for all the good that is being done through him, no matter what, you know, the clumsiness of it is, and that we use that to our advantage. Let me just say one other thing, that we're speaking here as if there is nothing being done on our side, but I know that among people that I know, the investment in good universities is going quite strong, and that instead of concentrating exclusively on what we're going to do with the bad actors here, there's been a lot of attention paid to shoring up and investing in universities that are doing the kind of teaching that we would like to support. And so there are now attempts being made to set up our own system of ranking universities in terms of our own criteria. Places like the University of Florida and the University of Austin and Vanderbilt. And what are the criteria by which we measure these? Well, one of these is leadership. And you find that where there is a good leader, a really solid president, where there is definitely a board of directors that supports this person, where there are even a couple of great faculty members who stand up and who know to be counted, that makes all the difference. And so, really, in this discussion, I think that one should include the way in which one builds as well as resists all that is being destroyed.
I think I couldn't agree more. Extremely sage analysis. It ended on a dangerously positive note. And as the researcher who focuses on the facts, I want to be a little more negative again. The threat for me with the Trump administration's approach here is that the big threat as we see it is Islamism, and that doesn't have necessarily a natural enemy on either side of the political spectrum. It has both its detractors and its admirers across the board. And one of the great worries for me is the current Islamist hold over conservative politics in the United States, the growing Islamist hold over conservative politics in the United States, and that extends to education. We already know of Qatar's powerful influence over Trump administration figures, a great many people in the cabinet, former lobbyists for Qatar. We also know, as Asaf talks about, the role of things like the Qatar Foundation, and it has links with prominent conservatives as well. Let's remember the Trump administration appealed heavily to Muslim voters in places like Michigan on the basis of education. It pointed to the left's bastardization of education, its efforts to use education to indoctrinate Muslim youth with LGBT ideas and all these things. So over the last few years, there has been a growing collaboration between Islamist activists and educators and conservative activists and educators in an effort to push back leftist influence in the education system. This is a big focus for both the Islamists and the Conservatives. The Conservatives see a new demographic, a new voting demographic. The Islamists see a new political medium through which they can advance their ideas. And this extends to K-12 as well. The Attorney General of Oklahoma just fought furiously and successfully against an effort in the Supreme Court to compel him to fund, sorry, not the Attorney General, it was the Attorney General, I'm sorry, to compel Oklahoma to fund Islamic private schooling and other religious private schooling in the state of Oklahoma. Well, naturally, the Islamists were very much in favor of this effort, and they were working with other conservative activists to try and force public dollars to subsidize theocratic ideas taught in private schools across Oklahoma. This is an effort happening across the nation. And if you look at groups like the Safa Network and also academics under their control at places like Georgetown, a huge amount of time, money, and effort is going into developing private K-12 curricula and infrastructure designed by both conservative and Islamist academic and activists to fundamentally reshape education in America. Now, there's a lot of very good arguments for pushing back against the public education system in its current form, and for pushing back against the overreach and the excess of the Department of Education. But having Islamism be part of the solution is a wildly dangerous idea that should be fought by conservatives, not embraced. So that's the huge fear for me, that we have conservatives so eager to win the Muslim conservative vote that they're now fundamentally allowing Islamism to infiltrate whole swathes of politics, including education policy. I think this is a real, clear and present danger, and it's not being talked about by those on the right enough, partly because of the fear of going against anything the Trump administration embraces or advocates. This is something we'll be writing and talking about a lot over the next year. So hopefully you'll see some essays and reports on this coming from us.
I don't disagree with any of my co-panelists here. I mean, I think that we're seeing here, I think it's a kind of a correlation of both. I mean, the question of, to Sam's last point on the issue of the politics, obviously, the case study of New York and Minneapolis are a clear, case study of where politics are playing into all of this at large. And, and I've always been, arguing that, whatever happens in the academy never stays in the academy. It's a larger feature of American society, which is why we need to, of course, safeguard our very institutions. I think that the concern has been, that the threat that is real, this a clear and present danger that Sam and we all agree that exists, has been looked at within academic circles as a feature of academic freedom. It's a matter of national security. And so I think that part of the question of the infiltration of Islamist forces into American academy, there has to be a red line when it comes to the admissions process, background checks, issues of FARA violations, when it comes to, and this is not only happening at the student level, I would also argue that it also relates to the faculty, and where they're getting their funding from, what kind of ties that they have. Again, going back to the case study of Georgetown, we've seen, the latest head of the Islamic Studies department who was removed. Again, he's also happens to be Sami Al-Aryan's son-in-law. There was a great deal of institutional terrorism within the academy. That being said, as someone who runs two faculty networks, as MIA and SPME, I don't disagree with with Ruth here, and I think that's also a feature of salvaging and making sure that we care about the academy. The question is, what does reform look like? It's not only about academic freedom, it's about academic responsibility and about, the places that are still working, like Florida and Vanderbilt and Austin. And if you're looking at the trajectory of where people are going, the Ivies, for better or for worse, are poison ivy, and people are going south in order to kind of try to find places where they can learn, and where they're safe when it comes to the correlation between conservative values, Jewish values, American values, where they're actually being safeguarded versus other places that are not. And that also has to do with a feature of the correlation related to the politics that Sam is mentioning between the state as it relates to enforcing cracking down on violations when it comes to anti-Semitism and discrimination and anti-BDS legislation, where the states have those laws in place and where they don't. That also impacts directly to the higher education institutions and the K through 12. And so I'm all for saving. Again, our membership as MIA and SPME, together, care about, the fact that, our members have where to teach, they have ability to teach what they research on their scholarship, but do it in the right way where they don't have to feel like they're fighting to maintain their safety as a result of the environment, that the hostility that they're in as a result of what's happening in the academy. And I think that's something that all of us care about, ensuring the fact that there is places of where to send our kids and grandkids going forward, given the fact that this has been a significant pillar of American society.
Thank you so much to everybody for our audience. We went a little bit longer. We had a lot to talk about, and I appreciate our guests staying on longer as well. Our brilliant panelists. As I said at the beginning, I knew that we were going to have a brilliant conversation. So I can't thank you all enough. Asaf, Sam, Ruth, for taking the time this afternoon and joining us. And please, as everybody watching, send the video far and wide. Very important conversation. I wish everybody a good afternoon. Thank you.